This wasn't random. This feeling didn't come from nowhere. How the brain notices manipulation. Have you ever left a conversation thinking, nothing bad actually happened, so why do I feel uncomfortable? The person sounded normal. They smiled. They said the right things. And yet something inside you changed. You became slightly more careful. You explained yourself more than usual. You started paying attention in a way you weren't before. And the strange part is this. By the time you start asking why something feels wrong, your brain may have already noticed several things your mind hasn't explained yet. The first signal. Manipulation rarely announces itself clearly. It usually begins with something much smaller. A tiny shift in atmosphere. Maybe a compliment lands strangely. Maybe a joke feels like it's testing something. Maybe someone becomes warm at the exact moment you start pulling away. None of these moments are big enough to confront. But the brain notices them anyway. Not as proof, but as pattern. And that's where things start becoming interesting. Why the feeling comes first. Most people think recognition works like this. First you understand something. Then you react to it. But the brain often works in the opposite order. First it detects a pattern. Then the body reacts. Only later does the mind try to explain why. So the feeling appears before the explanation, not because the feeling is irrational, because the calculation happened faster than language. A very common pattern. Here's a simple example. Someone is very warm with you, then suddenly distant, then warm again. On the surface it looks like mood, but your nervous system may register something else. Uncertainty. And uncertainty pulls attention. You start watching more closely. You reread messages. You think about tone. You try to figure out what changed. And that extra attention can feel like attraction. But not every intense focus is connection. Sometimes your brain is simply trying to classify someone as safe or unsafe. Fascination versus monitoring. This is one of the biggest confusions in relationships. People assume that if they think about someone constantly, it must mean the connection is deep. But sometimes the mind circles a person for a completely different reason. The pattern around them never settles. Something keeps shifting. Something never fully resolves. And the brain hates unresolved prediction. So it keeps watching. Not out of love. Out of surveillance. The first real clue. Often the earliest clue isn't what the other person says. It's what happens to you. You start speaking differently around them. You explain more. You soften your opinions faster. You notice that disagreement feels tense, but agreement suddenly feels easy. And that is important, because manipulation rarely forces behavior directly. More often it shapes the environment so that certain responses feel smooth, and others feel socially expensive. When you start adjusting. Imagine this pattern. You say something honest, they withdraw slightly, next time you share less. Or you give in on a small boundary. Suddenly they become warm again. Next time, compliance feels easier. No rule was spoken, no threat was made. But the nervous system learned something. Which version of you keeps the interaction stable? And that learning happens faster than most people realize. Why some conversations feel draining. This is why certain interactions feel exhausting even when nothing dramatic happened. From the outside, the conversation looked normal. But internally, your brain was doing extra work, tracking tone, watching reactions, predicting shifts, adjusting your language. So afterward, you feel mentally crowded. Not because you are weak, because your system stayed on alert. Real complexity versus manipulative complexity. Not every confusing person is manipulative. People are inconsistent. People are insecure. People are complicated. But there is an important difference. With genuine complexity, conversations eventually settle. You talk something through and feel clearer afterward. With manipulation, the interaction rarely settles. Something remains unfinished. You leave still decoding, still replaying, still slightly off balance, and the nervous system keeps the file open. When the pattern becomes visible. At first, the signs are small. You feel slightly smaller after conversations. You doubt yourself more. You think about the person more than the interaction deserves. You search for the one explanation that will make everything feel harmless. But eventually something becomes clear. The problem was never a single moment. It was the pattern. Warmth that keeps you close. Ambiguity that keeps you thinking. Pressure subtle enough that you question yourself before you question them. The strange thing about early signals. The first signal is easy to ignore because it doesn't sound like a warning. It feels like a small reduction in freedom. You can still speak, but not as freely. You can still choose, but not as comfortably. You can still stay in the interaction, but part of your attention is now watching for danger. Why the brain notices early. There is another reason these signals appear so quickly. The brain remembers social injury, not just dramatic betrayal. Smaller patterns too, being guilted, being cornered emotionally, being drawn in through warmth and then controlled through withdrawal. Even if you don't consciously think about those experiences anymore, the brain remembers their structure. So when a new interaction resembles that structure, the reaction can appear early. The reason people ignore it. Most people mistrust this signal because they cannot explain it clearly. If they cannot prove it, they assume it must be wrong. And this happens even faster when the other person seems charming, attentive, vulnerable, self-aware. But manipulation often succeeds by mixing sincerity with control. Not everything the person says is false. Sometimes the warmth is real. Sometimes the vulnerability is real. But the overall structure still moves the interaction in one direction, toward influence. The moment of realization. Eventually, the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. You notice that every interaction leaves you more confused, more vigilant, more self-editing. And that's when something shifts. You realize the discomfort didn't appear suddenly. It was there from the beginning. In the first joke that felt like a test. in the first compliment that felt strangely placed, in the first conversation where you started explaining yourself more than usual. When something feels off early, the feeling rarely comes from nowhere. Your brain may already be tracking shifts in pressure, tone, and control long before the conscious mind can explain them. Which is why many people misunderstand the situations later. They think the confusion began at the obvious moment, but often it began much earlier, in those small internal signals you almost ignored. And by the time the mind starts asking what's wrong, another part of you may have been noticing it from the beginning.
I'm Oliver, and now you know why this happens. Or at least a part of it.